So, engaging with best practice. So, just quickly, I'm going to do a brief introduction just for those people who perhaps don't always know. They see materials coming out of the foundation, but perhaps wonder where actually all the work gets done. And the truth is that an awful lot of hard work gets done in the working groups. And we'll be hearing from Chris Shire shortly, who's the chair of Working Group 1, the compliance framework, which is where all the work's done on the compliance framework. We will also be hearing from Jeff on Working Group 2, which is where he leads all the best practice work. Test and compliance has the misfortune of me leading it at the moment. That's simply because, as John explained earlier, that working group has made a transition from what was originally patching, which has in fact been migrated across to best practice. And we're now really starting to begin the drive on compliance, which I'll talk about a little bit later in this session. Responsible disclosure, so that's some earlier work that was being done by Working Group 4, and is an area that tends to pick up things like policy. So it's far more business orientated than necessarily technical. Consumer architecture, so there's been the architecture work that came out this year, which again we'll talk about a little bit later. And the new group, very much the new group for 2018, I'm pleased to announce the Smart Buildings Group. So we'll be hearing from Saab a little bit later around the work that's been done in that area. And as you gathered from the comments from Paul Dorey this morning, that's clearly quite a fertile area of ground. Lastly is what was our Trustmark group, but is very much the policy group. So the Working Group 7 is the group that looks at the things that we need to now consider about pulling together compliance and conformance. For those who don't know, we're not talking too much about that today. I think we've come to the conclusion, like most other organisations, that trust marks are not without their problems, and that in fact what is more important is to actually have a strong story on product conformance. And again, more about that in the later session. So, Release 1.0, for those who can remember back that far ago, 2 years ago, we launched our Release 1 of the various frameworks. I'm sure you're all aware. They were, as John mentioned earlier, they were all very much consumer focused. There were obviously some fairly significant upgrades 12 months ago with Release 1.1. And it's probably worth just briefly explaining why we use the term release. For anybody who's ever been worked in the cellular world, to say that cellular standards is evolved is something of an understatement. I mean, I think in the 3GPP world, we're now on about release 14. But there's a reason for that. And the reason is because we'd love to say we could publish the definitive work on IoT security, but we all know that the reality of that is just simply impractical. And as Tyson was illustrating beautifully this morning, this is a dynamic field. So therefore, the whole concept of the release process is that we are able then to be able to dynamically update and improve the work, to use John's expression this morning, on the various areas of our work. So, Release 2. So we started with consumer. It was clearly the area of major headlines, and we now, I'm very pleased to announce, we now have the framework Release 2. I'm not going to cover the details here. I'm going to leave that to Chris to cover the details. He's a far better place to do that than myself. But the really big change is the expansion of the framework. But as much as anything else, originally Release 1 was going to look at different product sectors. And it started to become fairly evident that number one, we were never going to choose the business sector that folks wanted, because we'd go that way, we'd go left and somebody else would want us to go right. But the other key point was that it became apparent that a risk-based approach was a far more appropriate way. I mean, even if you take the consumer market, it's a great example of just because you've done security for IP cameras or for some of the simpler products like light bulbs, do you have the same appetite for risk when that's the integrated door lock on your front door? Clearly the risk profiles are different. And that was one of the things that drove us to the changes in Release 2. In the area of best practice guides, there's been quite a bit of revamping and improving of the guides. And obviously the two big areas of work have been the architecture work this year, which was briefly touched upon earlier, both in the home and the enterprise space. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And just to give a little bit of context around the documents and almost, if you like, where we are going as the foundation, is just to see how things fit together. So one of the things we're trying to do now is to put together all of the various documents so they actually are a coherent story and they're not just, well, yes, you've got a compliance framework, but what do I do with that? So the other areas we're now looking at is the context that goes with that. And again, this has been driven by the risk appetite type approach. And then ultimately the goal is then that with the risk factors, the CIA triad, that will then drive into our conformance assessment process, which we're now really starting to get kicked off. So at this point, I'm not going to speak any further. If I may, I'm going to hand over to Chris Shire from Infineon to tell us more about Working Group 1.